Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're going to spend some quiet time with ancient Egypt, and we'll do it slowly, one small detail at a time, as if we were walking beside the river after sunset and noticing what the old stones still remember. There is so much in that world, but we do not need to hurry. A temple, a home, a name written carefully on papyrus, a boat moving along the Nile, a little object carried in a pocket. These are the kinds of things that can lead us gently into the past. If you enjoy these calm late-night journeys, you can like the video, subscribe, or leave a comment if you feel like it, perhaps with where you're listening from tonight, or what ancient place you might want to hear about next. For now, let the room grow softer around you. Let your eyes rest if you want them to. Imagine warm air over stone, the low sound of water, and a civilization that lasted so long that even its quiet details seem to echo. We'll begin with the Nile, and with the simple truth that in Egypt, almost everything starts near the river. The Nile was not only water, it was timing, direction, and reassurance. Every year, long before modern maps and clocks, the river rose and changed the land in a way people could depend on. It brought fertile silt, dark and rich, and left behind fields that could support wheat, barley, flax, and the small daily life of families who worked close to the water. It is easy, when looking back, to speak of ancient civilizations as if they were made of temples and kings alone. But a civilization is also bread needed in a quiet room. It is a jar of grain. It is a basket of reeds. It is the decision to plant again because the river returned again. Ancient Egyptians lived with this rhythm for thousands of years. The flood season, the planting season, the harvest season, these were not abstract ideas. They shaped calendars, work, food, and ritual. People looked at the sky, the river, and the land and learned to listen. There is something calming in that kind of life, even though it was never easy. The world had patterns. The river arrived. The fields awakened. The boats moved. The sun rose over the eastern bank and set over the western one. Day after day, the same broad cycle continued, and within it, ordinary people made meals, repaired tools, raised children, and tended to the dead. The Nile also connected Egypt in a practical way. It was a road that did not need paving. Boats could travel north and south with relative ease, using wind and current, carrying stone, grain, fish, linen, pottery, and people. The river made distance feel smaller. It tied towns together. It carried officials, traders, laborers, and priests. It made the country feel like one long living line of settlements, each with its own local habits and all of them joined by water. And because the river was so central, it became present in thought as well as in daily labor. Egyptian religion often reflected the landscape around it. The sun moved across the sky like a divine journey. The river repeated its cycle like a promise. Life, death, and rebirth were not distant philosophical ideas. They were visible in nature. If you pause on that image, it becomes easy to understand why so much Egyptian art feels steady and measured. The world they knew had deep, repeated rhythms, so the art often did too. Figures stood in profile. Colors were clear. Lines were orderly. A wall painting could hold the feeling of permanence, as if it wanted to do what the Nile itself did, return again and again. Yet for all this grandeur, much of Egypt was ordinary. Mud brick houses, courtyards, grinding stones, looms, children playing near doorways, a woman carrying water, a man shaping a piece of wood. The civilization is famous for the monumental, but it was built on the unremarkable, the daily, the repeated. And perhaps that is one reason the subject is so restful to visit in the mind. The scale is enormous, but the details are human. A river, a loaf of bread, a painted wall, a carved amulet. The simplest things can hold the whole mood of a world. When people imagine ancient Egypt, they often picture palaces, tombs, and golden objects. But most Egyptians lived in homes built from mud brick, a material that suited the climate and the land. These houses were practical, cooling in the heat, and often simple in shape. Some had rooftops used for sleeping on warm nights, or for working when the air was easier to bear. Inside there might be low furniture, baskets, jars, mats, and the small household objects that made life possible. Linen was important. It was lighter than wool and better suited to the heat. People wore simple garments, often white or pale, and the fabric itself became part of the feeling of the place, bright under the sun, clean in appearance, and well adapted to a dry climate. Tools were often made to last but not to impress. Copper and later bronze were used for many purposes. Stone grinders turned grain into flour. Needles, knives, chisels, sickles, and saws helped with work that was repeated every day. A lot of ancient life was careful, physical, and patient. There was no rush to make things in bulk, and there was no need to move fast in the modern sense. A person's world was smaller, but often more fully known. In these homes, food mattered deeply. Bread and beer were staples. Beer in ancient Egypt was not necessarily the same as modern beer in taste or strength. It was often a nourishing staple, part drink and part food in some contexts. Bread was central. Fish from the Nile, vegetables, onions, dates, figs, and other local foods filled out the diet depending on season and status. If you imagine a quiet household at the end of the day, you might picture the sound of grain being ground, the smell of baking, the careful storage of jars, and the routines of washing, mending, and preparing for tomorrow. These are not dramatic scenes, but they are the kind that make history feel close. The home was not isolated from the wider religious world. Small shrines or protective objects could appear in domestic spaces. Amulets were common in Egyptian life, and they were not only for the wealthy. People wore or kept them for protection, luck, health, and symbolic support. Some amulets took the shape of scarabs, symbols of renewal and movement. Others might represent gods, eyes, or other forms linked with protection. A scarab beetle itself was an ordinary creature, but in Egyptian thought it became more than that. Its movement across the ground, and the way life seemed to emerge from hidden places, gave it meaning. So a small object no bigger than a thumb could carry a world of belief. That is one of the gentle pleasures of studying Egypt. Tiny things matter: a bead, a seal, a comb, a bowl, a written label on a jar. In a culture famous for massive stone structures, it can be quietly moving to find how much attention was also given to the smaller, intimate parts of living. And because those small things were used daily, they connect us directly to the people who held them. We can imagine them reaching for a cup, tying cloth, setting down a tool, opening a doorway, or placing a charm somewhere safe. Such acts are still familiar, even across thousands of years. Writing in ancient Egypt was not only an art, it was administration, memory, religion, identity, and care. Hieroglyphs are the most famous form, and they are often the first image people think of when they think of Egyptian writing. But writing in Egypt was more varied than that. There were cursive forms too, used more quickly in daily life on papyrus, wood, and pottery. Papyrus, made from the stalks of the papyrus plant, was a remarkable material. It was light, useful, and well suited to a dry climate where many organic materials would have vanished. On it, scribes wrote letters, lists, records, accounts, instructions, prayers, and literary texts. The work of writing was itself a profession, and scribes were highly respected. There is something very calm about the idea of a scribe at work. Ink, reed pen, careful hand, a surface prepared for thought. Long before keyboards and screens, people shaped words slowly, and because they had to slow down, perhaps the words themselves felt more deliberate. Hieroglyphs were beautiful, but they were not merely decorative. They could encode sounds, ideas, and symbolic meaning. They appeared on temple walls, tombs, monuments, and objects. Some signs were easy to recognize, like birds, reeds, eyes, arms, or seated figures. Others fit together in elegant combinations. To the modern eye, they can look like art. To the ancient Egyptians, they were also functional language, embedded in sacred and practical life. The act of writing carried power. Names mattered deeply. To write a name was, in a sense, to preserve a person's presence. This is one reason so many tombs and monuments were inscribed. Egypt had a long concern with remembrance, and writing became part of that effort. Scribes likely spent years learning their craft, copying signs, practicing proportions, memorizing formulas. Not everyone needed to write, but many needed records, and in a complex society, records were vital. Grain had to be counted, labor had to be organized, tax obligations had to be noted, offerings had to be listed. Land had to be measured. A written record could outlast a spoken one. It could travel, it could be copied, it could survive the person who made it. And in Egypt, where survival after death was deeply imagined and carefully prepared for, writing became a bridge between life and continuation. Even now, when we see carved signs on stone or ink on papyrus fragments, there is a certain stillness in them. They are not noisy, they do not move quickly, they wait, they ask to be read slowly. There are documents that show ordinary concerns as well. A complaint, a purchase, a note about work, a list of supplies. These pieces of writing are especially lovely in a bedtime sense because they remind us that ancient people had the same small preoccupations that people always have. Food, work, family, timing, fairness, routine. History is often made out of such modest things. And sometimes the survival of a single text can feel almost like overhearing a whisper from across a very large room. A list survives, a letter survives, a school exercise survives. The world reappears in fragments, and those fragments are enough to make the past feel occupied, lived in and near. Egyptian temples were not simply places of gathering in the modern sense. They were sacred spaces where the divine and the human world met through ritual, offering, and order. Their scale can be overwhelming when seen in person or even in photographs, but it is worth remembering that the temple was also part of a system of belief that aimed to maintain harmony. The Egyptians had a strong sense that the world required balance. This idea appears in the concept of ma'at, often translated as truth, balance, order, or rightness. Ma'at was not just an abstract principle. It shaped how people thought about justice, kingship, ritual, and the proper maintenance of the world. A temple, then, was not only beautiful, it was necessary. Priests cared for statues of gods. They brought offerings, they performed rites, they tended spaces that were thought to help sustain cosmic order. The details could be highly formal: washing, dressing, presenting food, burning incense, speaking words that belong to a long tradition. One can imagine the atmosphere in such a place as quiet but not empty, full of controlled movement and the soft sounds of ceremony. Stone walls, carved reliefs, painted figures, columns like tall bundles of papyrus or lotus forms, and sunlight entering in thin, angled ways. The sensation is one of measured grandeur. Many Egyptian temples changed over centuries. Rulers added to them. Different dynasties expanded or modified them. A temple was not always a single act of construction, but often a long conversation between generations. Each ruler wanted to participate in continuity, to be seen as a maintainer of order. Offerings were central. Food, drink, incense, flowers, cloth, and other goods could be presented to gods. These were not mere symbolic gestures. In the ancient understanding, they participated in real relations between divine beings and human communities. What remains striking is how serious and calm the visual language of temples can be. Rows of figures, repeated scenes, offerings carried forward, the same gestures shown again and again. Repetition itself becomes sacred. It creates rhythm. It creates permanence. Some temples were dedicated to major gods like Ammon, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, or Hathor, each with their own local forms and stories. But the details varied from site to site, and the landscape of belief was not always identical across Egypt. That variety is important. Ancient Egypt was not a single frozen moment. It was a long-lived civilization with changes in power, custom, and emphasis. And even in that wide span of time, the temple remained a point of focus, a place where stone, ritual, and memory met. If you stand in your imagination among painted walls and polished floors, you may notice that much of the space is devoted to keeping things in order, keeping things named, and keeping things aligned with a cosmic pattern. That is a soothing thought in a way. The world as they saw it could be maintained, the sun could be honored, the dead could be remembered, the living could continue their work. and in the quiet of a temple, that hope could feel almost tangible. The pharaoh is one of the most recognizable figures from ancient Egypt, yet the role was more complex than a simple image of a king. The pharaoh was both ruler and symbolic link in the order of the world. Royal power was not only political, it was sacred, ceremonial, and tied to the idea of maintaining balance. Kingship in Egypt was expressed through symbols. The crown, the crook and flail, the false beard in some artistic representations, the cartouches surrounding royal names, the special regalia of ceremony, all of these communicated more than status. They showed a person fitted into a vast system of meaning. There were periods of strong central rule, and periods when power shifted, fragmented, or changed form. Egypt's long history includes dynasties rising and falling, and the royal image adapted over time. Still, the king or queen in certain eras remained part of the ceremonial center of the civilization. It is easy to think of rulers as distant and purely grand, but even in royal life there were practical concerns. Administration, alliances, taxation, building projects, labor organization, and the protection of borders all mattered. A ruler was expected to provide stability, and stability was precious in a land where the river and the desert each demanded respect. Royal names were carefully chosen and preserved. They could include references to gods or ideals. To speak the name of a ruler was to place them in memory. To carve their name on stone was to extend that memory beyond a single reign. Many rulers built monuments not only for vanity, but because building itself was a kind of authority. To order stone into a monument was to declare that one's time should endure. The same is true of inscriptions. The same is true of temples. The same is true of tombs. Some queens held great power in their own right. Ancient Egypt is especially interesting because women in royal or elite contexts could occupy significant roles, depending on the period. That adds another layer of nuance to the story. It was not a simple, one-dimensional world. It had space for influence, diplomacy, motherhood, priestly roles, and political adaptability. The image of a throne room can seem dramatic, but perhaps the more interesting thing is the quiet infrastructure behind it. Messengers, officials, record keepers, estate managers, architects, craftsmen, and laborers all made the appearance of royal authority possible. And as always in Egypt, the symbolic world and the practical world touched each other closely. A crown might represent divine order, but it also rested on a human head. A seal might mark ownership, but it also guided the movement of goods. A name might signal eternity, but it had to be written by a hand. So when we think of kings and queens in ancient Egypt, it helps to picture both the ceremonial grandeur and the hidden network beneath it. The large forms rested on countless small acts. The throne depended on the room depended on the workers depended on the river, and the river, patient and recurring, continued to move. Few subjects are as closely associated with ancient Egypt as the tomb, yet tombs were not simply places of ending. They were carefully prepared spaces for transition, memory, and survival. They reflected an Egyptian understanding that death was a passage into another form of existence, not a total erasure. Tombs could contain goods meant to support the dead or to symbolize the necessities of the afterlife. Food, furniture, jars, clothing, jewelry, tools, figurines, and written texts could all appear in burial contexts. The choices varied over time and by status, but the underlying intention often remained the same. The dead should have what they need. The names should endure. The path should be prepared. The famous pyramid complexes belong to a particular phase of Egyptian history, but they have come to stand for the civilization as a whole. Their geometry is striking. Clean lines, massive scale, a sense of intentional permanence. They were tombs, but they also expressed state power, labor organization, and religious ideas about kingship and the sky. Smaller tombs, however, may feel even more intimate. Painted scenes of daily life could appear on their walls. People bringing offerings, hunters in marshes, Workers in fields, banquets, boats, family members. These images often were not just decorative. They helped sustain the dead in the next world by depicting and, in a symbolic sense, providing what was needed. Ancient Egyptian funerary belief is sometimes described in grand terms, but one of its most human features is its tenderness toward continuity. A person should not simply disappear. A name should be spoken. An image should remain. A body should be protected if possible. Offerings should continue. The dead should be included in the ongoing life of the family and community. The process of mummification is often the part people remember first. It was a method of preserving the body, linked to beliefs about identity and survival. But mummification was not just a dramatic ritual. It was a craft, a practice with steps, materials, and expertise. It reflected both religious devotion and practical knowledge of preservation in a dry climate. Not every burial was lavish. Many people were buried more simply. The contrast itself is meaningful. Ancient Egypt was not a world where every person received a pyramid or gold-laden chamber. Like all societies, it had differences in status and wealth. Yet even modest burials could express care and hope. There is a soft stillness to tomb art when you look at it slowly. A figure carrying a basket, a line of offering bearers, a boat gliding across a painted wall. These scenes do not shout. They repeat. They hold. They ask to be considered with patience. And in some cases, tombs have preserved faces, textiles, and wooden objects in astonishing ways, allowing us to meet the past not only through architecture, but through touchable, vulnerable material. Linen folded long ago, a sandal, a comb, a painted box. The objects feel almost domestic, almost near enough to have been used yesterday. That is part of the quiet wonder of Egyptian burial practices. They were built around continuity, but what they left behind feels deeply personal. A tomb can be vast, a coffin can be small, both can carry memory. Egyptian religion was full of animals, and not in a random way. Creatures were watched closely, and their habits became part of symbolic thought. The falcon, the jackal, the ibis, the cat, the crocodile, the lion, the cow, the serpent, the beetle, all could carry associations with divine forces or qualities. This does not mean that Egyptians simply worshipped animals in a simple sense. Rather, animals served as visible forms through which larger powers could be understood. The falcon could suggest kingship and the sky. The jackal could suggest burial grounds and protection. The cat could suggest grace, domestic life, and sometimes fierce independence. The crocodile, both feared and respected, reminded people of the Nile's dangerous power as well as its gifts. Animal imagery appeared in temple reliefs, amulets, statues, and personal objects. In homes and towns, animals were part of work and life. Birds, fish, livestock, and household animals all contributed to the daily environment. The sacred and the practical were not separate boxes. They overlapped constantly. One of the most beloved Egyptian goddesses in later imagination is Bastet, often associated with the cat. Cats in ancient Egypt had a strong presence in art and domestic life. They may have helped control rodents around grain stores, but they also came to symbolize something more delicate and protective. A cat can be both gentle and watchful, and that combination seems especially fitting for a civilization so attentive to order. Other divine forms were similarly layered. Isis became associated with healing, motherhood, and protection. Osiris with death, renewal, and the underworld. Horus with kingship and the sky. Thoth with writing, wisdom, and calculation. Each god or goddess could be local, complex, and shifted by time. What is restful about these images is their coherence. The Egyptians saw their world as full of meaning. A bird's flight, a river's rise, a scarab's movement, the changing of seasons, all could speak in symbolic language. Nothing had to be plain in order to be understood. Instead, the world was read like a living text. And because images mattered so much, art became a kind of quiet explanation. A painted cat, a carved ibis, a small faience amulet, these were not random decorations. They were visible thoughts. Sometimes the Egyptian approach can feel almost meditative. Look closely, notice the form, notice the relationship between a creature and a concept. Notice the way a symbol can repeat across surfaces and years. Even today, museum cases often hold these small animal forms with a kind of luminous patience. A tiny amulet catches the light. A statue of a cat sits with composed stillness. A falcon head seems to watch from a distance. They are easy to pass by quickly, but they reward slower looking, and slower looking is very much the mood of this evening. So if your mind is drifting a little, that is perfectly fine. Think of the creature forms of Egypt as quiet companions in a long, orderly world, each one carrying a small piece of meaning from place to place, and from life to life. Large civilizations can seem to rise by themselves when we view them only through monuments. But every visible monument rests on invisible labor. In ancient Egypt, that labor came from farmers, builders, craftsmen, herders, boatmen, bakers, brewers, scribes, and many others whose names are mostly unrecorded. Stone was cut from quarries, blocks were moved, ramps, ropes, sledges, and organized teams made construction possible. Wood was shaped where wood was available and reused carefully because some materials were precious. Potters made vessels for storage, cooking, and transport. Weavers turned flax into linen. Metal workers handled copper, bronze, and other materials with skill. There is something gentle in the thought of craftsmanship as a daily discipline, a hand repeating a motion, a tool fitting the hand, a maker learning the feel of a material. The ancient world was full of these repeating acts, and they accumulated into the civilization we now look at from a distance. Some of the most interesting evidence from Egypt comes not from the grand centers of power, but from workers' villages and practical sites. These places show families, homes, tools, food waste, scribbled notes, and the ordinary material traces of people who built and served the larger system. They remind us that civilization is not only an idea, it is labor made visible. The organization of work could be complex. Labor was not always the same as modern wage labor, and the structure of obligations varied across time and place. Some workers were conscripted for projects, others were part of state systems, specialists trained for particular tasks. The details matter because they keep us from flattening the past into a single simple picture. What remains constant is the human quality of effort. Someone had to measure, someone had to cut, someone had to carry, someone had to count, someone had to inspect. Someone had to clean, someone had to keep records so that the whole system would function. And yet, despite the scale, the surviving objects often feel intimate. A hammer with worn use, a palette for paint, a chisel, a bread mold, a weaving weight. These are the kinds of things that show civilization from the inside. Even the grandest building projects depended on small repeated choices, like whether to align a stone correctly, how to transport it, how to maintain tools, how to feed the crews, how to record the work. The beauty of the finished monument hides all of that practical effort, but the effort is there, held within the stone like a memory. The same is true of daily life. A family's routine of fetching water, tending children, preparing food, and working with materials may never appear on a royal inscription, but it sustained the entire society. History often remembers the shining surfaces first, but the surfaces were supported by countless hands. In that sense, ancient Egypt is not only a civilization of monuments, it is a civilization of making bread, making cloth, making boats, making images, making records. Making the future possible, one careful task at a time. The sky in ancient Egypt was not a blank background, it was a field of meaning. The sun's movement, the stars, the moon, and the changing seasons all shaped religious thought and practical planning. Egyptian time was both observational and sacred. The sun was especially important. Ra or Re was associated with the solar journey, and many myths imagined the sun's passage across the sky and through the underworld in a cycle of renewal. The daily rising and setting of the sun became one of the strongest images of continuity in Egyptian thought. This is easy to understand if you imagine life beside the river and desert. Every dawn brought light over the eastern horizon. Every evening brought the sun down toward the west, the direction often associated with the dead. Day and night felt like part of a larger pattern, one that was both beautiful and slightly solemn. Egyptians observed the heavens with care. They used the stars in ways that helped with timekeeping and orientation. Certain stars or star groups could be linked with seasons or ceremonies. The sky was not infinite abstraction. It was a practical and sacred map. Calendrical knowledge mattered to agriculture, ritual, and administration. Knowing when the Nile would rise, when to prepare fields, when to schedule offerings, and when festivals should occur was deeply useful. A civilization with a strong ritual life also needed a strong sense of timing. There is a quiet dignity in that. To live well, one had to pay attention, not in a stressful modern sense, but in a sustained and patient way. Notice the river, notice the sky, notice the heat, notice the stars, notice the return of a season. Egyptian myths often reflect this concern with cycles. Death is not only ending, night is not only darkness. The journey through hidden places is followed by renewal. That pattern shows up again and again in religion, art, and funerary practice. It also gives Egyptian culture a peculiar calmness in hindsight. Even when the themes are serious, the structure is reassuring. Things move, things return, things are renewed. This may be one reason Egyptian imagery still feels so enduring. It does not insist on chaos, it insists on pattern. If you look at a temple ceiling painted with stars or an amulet shaped with celestial symbolism, you can almost feel that old attention to order. The ceiling becomes more than decoration. It becomes a sky inside a room within a world that was already carefully measured. And in that measured world, people could still wonder. They looked up, they saw the night, they watched the sun. They trusted that the pattern would continue because it always had. That trust, repeated day after day, is one of the gentlest feelings history can offer. Ancient Egypt also preserved traces of medical knowledge, though it should be remembered that ancient medicine mixed practical observation, ritual and spiritual belief in ways that are different from modern systems. Even so, the surviving evidence shows people paying attention to wounds, conditions, remedies, and the care of the body. Medical texts from Egypt can be surprisingly detailed. They sometimes describe symptoms, suggest treatments, and note outcomes. Honey, for example, appears in several ancient contexts because of its usefulness and perceived healing properties. Bandaging, cleaning, and the use of plant-based remedies also appear in the broader record. At the same time, sickness could be understood through spiritual and divine frameworks. Protection and healing were not always separated. Amulets, prayers, and ritual actions could accompany practical care. This layered approach makes sense in a world where the boundaries between the visible and the invisible were felt very closely. One can imagine a household dealing with illness in a quiet way, with family members, a healer, or a priestly figure responding according to the knowledge available at the time. There may be lists of ingredients, careful applications, and spoken words of support. The mood is not far from what we recognize now, even if the methods differ. Pregnancy, childbirth, injury, and childhood health all would have required attention. Survival in the ancient world was always precarious by modern standards, and that reality gave every form of care a deep importance. A remedy was never just a technical act. It was a hope. Many protective charms and ritual texts were intended to guard people against illness or harmful forces. This reflects another basic truth about ancient Egypt, that the world was thought to contain dangers that could be managed through knowledge, order, and divine assistance. It is comforting in a strange way to see how much weight was given to protection. The Egyptians did not assume the world was safe. They built layers of support around themselves. Words, symbols, objects, rituals, practical care, all of them together. The body itself was also treated with seriousness in preparation for burial. which again shows the Egyptian concern with bodily continuity and identity. Body, name, image, and spirit were related. To care for one was to care for the others. This may be why so many surviving Egyptian objects feel emotionally close even now. A medical papyrus, a small amulet, a protective spell, a jar of ointment, a bandaged figurine, these are not only relics. They are signs of people trying to endure, and endurance, when seen gently, is one of the most restful subjects of all. It suggests patience, it suggests care, it suggests a human willingness to continue, even in uncertain conditions. Ancient Egypt was full of that willingness, and the traces of it remain very soft and very clear. Egypt was defined as much by its borders as by its river. The desert was never merely empty space. It was a physical boundary, a source of resources, a place of danger, and a reminder that life in Egypt depended on a narrow band of habitability. Beyond the cultivated land were quarries, trade routes, and routes through the desert that connected Egypt with neighboring regions. These connections brought incense, stone, metals, oils, timber, and other goods, depending on era and destination. Egypt was not sealed off from the world. It traded, exchanged, and interacted with many places and peoples. This broader view is important because ancient Egypt can sometimes look isolated in popular imagination. In reality, it was part of a wider ancient world with movement and contact. Foreign objects appear in Egyptian contexts. Egyptian objects appear elsewhere. Ideas moved as well as materials. The edge of the desert also held symbolic force. It was a place where order gave way to uncertainty. Tombs often sat on the western side of the land, where the sun set. The west was associated with the dead, while the east was associated with rebirth and the rising sun. Such spatial symbolism gave landscape a spiritual grammar. If you think of the landscape at dawn or dusk, the effect becomes easier to feel. The cultivated green strips near the river, the pale sand farther out, the changing color of stone, the quiet movement of birds, the long horizontal lines of land and sky. There were also settlements and workers' sites near the edges of the desert, especially where stone or other resources were needed. These places can be especially evocative because they show the practical relationship between people and landscape. Life was not only on the riverbanks, it extended into places that had to be managed, crossed, and understood. Trade routes are often imagined as noisy and adventurous, but there was also a calm routine to them. Wagons, pack animals, boats, inventories, porters, and official oversight all contributed to the exchange of goods. A distant object once arrived became part of daily life at home. A piece of wood, a mineral, a scent, a metal tool. In this way, the desert edge reminds us that ancient Egypt was not static. It was a living system with movement at its margins. The center was the river, yes, but the edges mattered too. And there is a certain bedtime comfort in considering places between places. Not only cities, not only wilderness, but the in-between spaces where roads, tracks, and waterways carried things quietly onward. That is where much of history actually happens, in the passage from one known point to another. Despite the serious tone that often surrounds ancient Egypt in modern imagination, people there also celebrated. Festivals brought communities together in ways that likely felt vivid, noisy, and sometimes joyful. These occasions could honor gods, rulers, harvest cycles, or important local traditions. Music was part of that social and ritual life. Harps, lutes, flutes, drums, clappers, and singing are all part of the broader ancient Egyptian record. Artistic depictions show musicians and dancers in banquet scenes, religious processions, and festive settings. Sound was present in both sacred and social spaces. The idea of a banquet in ancient Egypt is especially appealing because it combines order and pleasure, seated guests, food laid out, perfumed oils, music nearby, servants moving carefully. It is a scene of refinement but also one of human enjoyment. Perfume and scent were valued as well. Oils, cones, and aromatic materials appear in depictions and texts. A world as warm and dry as Egypt would naturally give importance to cooling, cleansing, and fragrant substances. Smell itself becomes part of the atmosphere of the period, a detail easy to miss but pleasant to imagine. Festivals likely varied from city to city and from one historical period to another. Some were tied to divine statues being carried in procession. Others marked major ritual calendars or agricultural turning points. The details changed, but the desire to gather and affirm community stayed constant. There is also a softness in how art presents celebration, people holding flowers, guests wearing wigs or formal dress, musicians seated close together, offerings on trays. The visuals are orderly, but the mood can feel warm. Ancient Egyptian dance, like music, was part performance and part social expression. We see enough in the sources to know that movement mattered, even if the exact steps are lost to time. The body in festival settings was not only functional, it was expressive, and when one thinks of festivals alongside the rest of Egyptian life, the civilization becomes fuller. It is not only construction and burial, not only kings and gods, it is also rhythm, music, and shared enjoyment. A civilization is not complete without its moments of communal ease. Perhaps that is why these scenes are so gentle to imagine tonight. A procession moving slowly, an instrument sounding in the distance, a scent rising in warm air, a family or crowd gathering under a bright sky. The moment passes, but the feeling remains. One of the strange gifts of ancient Egypt is preservation. The dry climate helped protect objects that would have vanished in wetter places: papyrus fragments, wood, textiles, painted surfaces, human remains, small domestic goods. Even the traces of food can sometimes survive well enough to be studied. This means that Egypt often feels closer to us than some other ancient worlds, not because it was more human, but because more of its human details remain visible. We can look at a comb and see where. A jar can still have its shape. A loaf impression can still be studied. A school exercise can show a young learner practicing writing long ago. It is easy to romanticize survival, but preservation is only partial. Vast amounts are gone, whole settlements are erased, the record is uneven. What remains is a selection shaped by climate, burial practice, accident, and archaeology. Still, even the incomplete record is rich enough to create a strong sense of presence. A museum object can feel almost like a hand extended from the past, not because it tells the whole story, but because it carries one clear part of it. The curve of a vessel, the painted edge of a coffin, the smoothness of a bead, the worn handle of a tool. These small surviving things resist forgetting. Ancient Egypt also survives in the imagination because its images are so distinct: gold and blue, sand and stone, black ink on pale papyrus, animal forms, repeated profiles, tall figures, and careful symmetry. The visual language has a kind of enduring calm, but we should not forget that the civilization was always changing. Language evolved, beliefs shifted, foreign rule arrived in some periods, artistic conventions adapted. The Egypt of one era was not the Egypt of another. It lasted a long time, and because it lasted so long, it contained many versions of itself. That breadth is part of the wonder. We often speak of Egypt as though it were one story, but it was really many stories layered together. The earliest dynastic periods, the Pyramid Age, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, the later periods, each had their own texture. And through all of those long changes, ordinary people still made bread, wrote notes, buried family members, cared for animals, and watched the river. That is perhaps the most comforting thought of all. Grand histories move, but daily life continues in small forms. So if you are feeling sleep begin to gather at the edges of the room, let it. The surviving traces of Egypt do not demand urgency. They invite slow attention, and slow attention is a kind of rest. And so, as the night deepens, we leave ancient Egypt in a softer light. Not as a distant monument, but as a lived world, full of riverbanks, homes, names, offerings, tools, songs, and the patient work of people who wanted order, continuity, and remembrance. The stones remain, but so do the small things, the bowls, the beads, the papyrus lines, the amulets, the marks of hands. History can feel very large from a distance, yet when we look closely it becomes a series of quiet rooms, each one holding a little warmth, a loaf baked, a prayer spoken, a boat launched, a letter written, a star observed, a name preserved. You can stay here a little longer in that calm space beside the river where the sand is warm, the water keeps moving, and the past does not rush us. Good night. And even there at the edge of sleep, the Nile continues its patient work in the mind. It is easy to imagine the river as a simple ribbon through the landscape, but in ancient Egypt it was much more than a geographic feature. It was a calendar, a road, a source of soil, a mirror of the sky, and a rhythm that quietly organized life. The river rose and fell in its own measured time. People watched those changes with close attention because so much depended upon them. The water did not merely pass through the land, it taught the land how to live. In the seasons of flooding, the Nile spread across the banks and laid down dark, fertile silt. That silt was one of the great gifts of Egypt. It was the reason cultivation could thrive in a place otherwise shaped by desert. It settled into the fields and nourished the crops. It made the river valley a long, green corridor between expanses of sand and stone. When one thinks of Egypt, one often thinks first of gold or sandstone, but for the people who lived there, the most important color may have been the rich dark of the earth after the waters withdrew. There is something quietly moving about that annual pattern. Flood, retreat, planting, harvest, rest, and then flood again. A cycle repeated with enough reliability to become part of the imagination. The river did not remove uncertainty entirely, of course. A flood too low could bring hardship. A flood too high could damage homes or fields. Yet even uncertainty had a shape, and that shape was known. People listened for signs. They measured water. They prayed. They adapted. It can be restful to think of a civilization built around observation. Not a frantic observation, but a patient one, watching the stars, watching birds, watching the river, watching the color of the sky before dawn. The Egyptians were attentive to patterns because patterns mattered. A world that depends on order encourages a kind of careful seeing, and perhaps that is one reason their monuments feel so composed. The pyramids, the temples, the tombs, the avenues of statues, the painted walls, the columns like bundled papyrus or lotus stems, all of it seems to reflect a desire to make the world legible, to give permanence to shape and meaning. Even when the meaning is no longer fully clear to us, the form remains soothing in its balance. The pyramids are among the most familiar of ancient structures, but familiarity can sometimes hide their strangeness. They are enormous, yet simple in outline. Their sides rise with a steady seriousness, as if the earth itself had been taught to lean inward toward the sky. We think of them as tombs, and they were tombs, but they were also statements about time, authority, the heavens, and the continuing life of the dead. They were built to last, and in that they succeeded beyond almost anything else human beings have made. And yet the Pyramid Age was only one chapter in a long story. Later temples became even more elaborate in some ways, with broad pylons, deep courts, shadowed halls, and walls crowded with inscriptions. These spaces were designed not just for grandeur, but for ritual movement. Light gave way to darkness. Open courts led to enclosed sanctuaries. One could imagine entering such a temple at dawn, when the first sunlight touched the stone, and feeling the transition from the noisy outer world into a quieter interior sacred to gods and kings. Ancient Egyptian religion is often described through its many gods, and there were many with histories that changed over time. Some were local, some became national, some merged with others or took on new roles. The sun god traveled each day across the sky and each night through the underworld. Osiris came to embody death, renewal, and judgment. Isis became a figure of protection and magic. Horus linked kingship with divine order. Thoth, associated with writing and measurement, spoke to the human longing to record and understand. Hathor carried the tenderness of music, joy, and maternal care. Anubis guarded the dead. Sobek drew the river's force into the body of a crocodile. Many deities were tied to places, animals, and natural cycles, as though the sacred were woven into the landscape itself. These gods are distant to us now, yet they reveal something enduringly human. People have always tried to give shape to what feels larger than themselves. The sky, the flood, the sun, the unseen presence of death, the mystery of birth, the hope that names might survive. Myth helps make such things habitable. It places them in stories. It gives them faces. It does not remove mystery, but it lets mystery sit beside us more gently. There is a particular softness in Egyptian funerary practice, despite its solemnity. The care given to the dead was an expression of care for continuity. Tombs were provisioned with objects that might be useful, symbols that might protect, texts that might guide. In some periods, the interior walls of tombs carried spells and images meant to help the deceased travel safely into the afterlife. Later, coffins themselves were inscribed with words of protection. Small amulets were placed with the body, each one holding a certain hope. A scarab, an eye, a knot, a tiny figure. These objects were not large, but their meanings were substantial. The famous Book of the Dead is not a single book in the modern sense, but a collection of spells and instructions. The title itself is a later convenience. Still, the idea is beautiful in a quiet way, a guide for the soul made of words. In a civilization so attentive to writing, text could become a form of passage. Ink became a kind of companion. The written line was not merely informative, it was protective, ceremonial, enduring. Papyrus, of course, was one of Egypt's great materials. Grown in the marshes, cut and pressed into sheets, it allowed records to travel. Accounts, letters, hymns, medical texts, literary tales, administrative lists, legal documents, school exercises. The written legacy of Egypt is vast and varied. Some of it is very practical, some of it is poetic, some of it is playful, some of it is very old and formal, while some of it feels almost intimate, as though we are overhearing a working day long ago. A letter asking about bread. A note concerning deliveries, an account of labor, a sketch in the margin, a student practicing signs, a scribe learning the patient craft of memory. These fragments are especially moving because they are ordinary. A great many of them were never meant to be celebrated. They were tools of daily life, yet now they carry the atmosphere of the rooms in which they were used. We can imagine a reed pen, a low table, a measured hand, the faint smell of ink and dust, the sound of movement nearby. Writing in Egypt had status, but it was also practical. Scribes occupied an important place in administration, temples, and households. To write was to preserve order. To count was to help the kingdom function. To measure was to keep the flood, the harvest, the storehouse, the tax, and the offering in a relationship that could be managed. The world of Egypt depended on records as much as on stone, and records create a special kind of afterlife. A name written down can outlast a voice. A list can outlast a meal. A receipt can outlast the grain it records. This may seem a small kind of immortality, but ancient Egypt knew the value of small continuities. The dead were remembered not only in monuments, but in household offerings, in spoken names, in repeated rituals, in lines of script copied by hand. To be remembered was to remain in some form. There are also quietly the human faces of power. Pharaohs are often presented as symbols, but they were people too, living within institutions, beliefs, and limitations. They were crowned with expectations. Their images were polished into ideal forms, yet each one belonged to a moment in the long sequence of Egyptian time. Some were builders, some were warriors, some were reformers, some were children placed unexpectedly on the throne. Some are famous to us now because their monuments survived well, while others are known mostly from inscriptions and fragments. Hatshepsut stands out in the historical imagination, not only because she was a woman who ruled as pharaoh, but because her reign reminds us that Egyptian history was never static. She sponsored building projects and trading expeditions, and her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri remains one of the most graceful structures in ancient architecture. Its terraces climb the cliff with a calm dignity, almost like a stairway made for light. The place feels composed and deliberate, as though geometry itself had been persuaded to rest. Then there is Akhenaten, whose religious changes continue to invite reflection. For a time, the emphasis on a single solar deity altered the artistic and political language of Egypt. The city of Amarna was built and then abandoned. The period left behind beautiful and strange images, faces elongated, bodies rendered with a new sensitivity. It is one of the reminders that even a civilization famed for continuity had moments of experiment, upheaval, and uncertainty. Human beings do not remain fixed for long, even when their monuments suggest otherwise. And there is Tutankhamun, whose fame rests less on his reign than on the survival of his tomb. The treasures found there revealed the richness of royal burial culture, but they also became a kind of global mirror in which modern people saw their own fascination with the past. A mask of gold, chests, furniture, jewelry, sandals, ceremonial objects, all arranged around a young king whose life was brief. The tomb seemed to preserve a pause in time. It gave us a room that had been sealed for over 3,000 years and then opened again to light. Such openings are always a little melancholy. A tomb is not meant to be seen in the way a museum sees it. Yet archaeology, with all its questions and responsibilities, lets us approach the ancient world in a partial but meaningful way. It is a discipline of fragments, a shard, a wall fragment, a burial, a seal, a footprint in dried mud, a broken statue with the face still serene. Every piece is a reminder that the past survives in interruptions as much as in completeness. Sometimes the smallest objects are the most affecting. A cosmetic spoon carved in the shape of a floating woman, a wooden figure, a piece of jewelry with blue faience, a little game board, a box of linen, a child's toy, a spoon, a comb, a mirror, a needle, a seal, a ring. These are the things that quietly testify to domestic life. They tell us that people in ancient Egypt cared about appearance, cleanliness, comfort, amusement, and the arrangement of daily routine. Civilization is not only built from kings and temples, it is also built from ordinary handling, the repeated use of hands. The Nile encouraged towns and cities along its banks, and those settlements had their own layered character. There were administrative centers, temple towns, agricultural villages, artisan communities, and port areas linked to trade. Some were lively and crowded, some were modest, some rose in importance and later faded. The river connected them while also setting limits. Movement was easier along the water than across the desert. Boats were essential. Sails caught the wind from one direction, oars and current from another. Travel along the river was itself a pattern of cooperation with the environment. Boats appear often in Egyptian imagery because they mattered so deeply in everyday life and in cosmology. The sun itself was imagined as traveling in a boat. The dead, too, might journey by water. A boat is a fitting image for this civilization because it is a shape of passage. It holds people between places. It moves, but it also contains. It is directional without being hurried. Even now, the thought of drifting upon calm water can slow the breath. There is a tenderness in the Egyptian attention to transition, dawn and dusk, life and death, river rising and river falling, temple outer court and hidden in a chamber, human flesh and mummified preservation, spoken name and written name. Each threshold received attention. The world was not divided into simple opposites but arranged in stages. This sense of passage may be one reason Egyptian art and religion continue to fascinate. They do not merely describe things, they stage movement between states. And the art itself is quietly extraordinary. A painted scene from a tomb can feel both formal and alive. Birds in marsh reeds, workers harvesting grain, banquet guests with perfume cones, musicians and dancers, offerings arranged in careful symmetry, animals moving through the field of the image. The perspective is often unlike modern realism, yet the effect is not cold. It is purposeful and elegant. The viewer is invited to notice sequence, function, and presence all at once. Blue and green were especially meaningful colors. Blue suggested the sky, water, and the divine. Green suggested life, growth, renewal. Gold carried associations of the sun and the imperishable. Red could suggest power or danger. Black, far from being only a color of mourning, could evoke fertile silt and regenerative force. Color in Egypt was not just decoration, it was part of meaning. Even the materials chosen for objects often carried symbolic value. Faience, with its glazed brightness, had a luminous quality that suited amulets and small sacred things. Stone was selected not only for durability, but for association. Precious stones and imported materials connected local craftsmanship with distant lands. The presence of lapis lazuli, for example, hints at far-reaching exchange networks and the desire for color that seemed to hold the night sky inside it. Trade linked Egypt to regions beyond the Nile Valley, to the south, to Nubia and lands farther along the river, to the northeast to the Levant, across the Red Sea to more distant shores. Through these routes came goods, people, ideas, and influences. Egypt was not sealed off from the world. It was a center in a web of contact, and like many long-lasting civilizations, it both absorbed and transformed what it encountered. The lands to the south held their own histories and kingdoms, sometimes allied with Egypt, sometimes in tension with it. Nubia, for instance, shared long and complex relationships with Egypt, including periods of rule, exchange, and cultural blending. The border between them was never simply a line. It was a zone of movement. Gold, soldiers, priests, traders, captives, and goods all passed through or across it. In the quiet of evening, it is worth remembering that ancient history is rarely a story of isolated peoples. It is a story of contact, negotiation, and shared river systems. The desert, too, was not empty. It preserved, it protected, it concealed. Tombs were cut into cliffs. Workmen's villages were tucked away from main routes. Quarries supplied stone. Roads crossed barren stretches to reach mines and oases. The silence of the desert may seem absolute in modern imagination, but ancient people knew it as inhabited in another way. It held dangers, certainly, but also roots, resources, and sacred places. The vast stillness around the Nile Valley gave the river's movement even more significance. There are, in Egyptian religious landscapes, many hidden places of particular atmosphere. The Valley of the Kings, for instance, lies not as a city of the dead in the simplistic sense, but as a carefully chosen burial landscape cut among the rocks. The cliffs catch the changing light. The paths are dry and pale. The tombs descend into the earth like carefully protected chambers of intention. Nearby, the Valley of the Queens holds another set of quiet passages. The geography itself seems contemplative. Elsewhere, Deir el-Medina, the village of artisans who worked on royal tombs, gives us a rare and intimate glimpse of community life. Here we encounter workers' homes, personal letters, legal disputes, religious devotion, and the daily details of a specialized settlement. It is one of those sites that makes ancient Egypt feel especially near, because it offers not only monuments but neighbors, people with grievances, hopes, responsibilities, and routines. People who named their children, repaired their roofs, quarreled, reconciled, and kept household altars. The ancient world becomes gentler and more real when we can hear its domestic voice. One can imagine an evening in such a village, the day's labor complete, tools set aside, the air cooling after heat, conversation moving quietly from one doorway to another, a lamp lit, bread broken, a child asleep nearby, a short prayer. The sense that the next day will bring more work, but also the comfort of familiarity. Much of history consists of such evenings, unnoticed and unrecorded, and yet full of life. It is often said that the Egyptians were obsessed with death, but that can be misleading. They were certainly attentive to death because they were attentive to continuity. Their concern was not morbid in a modern sense. It was relational. The dead remained part of the community through memory, offering, and ritual. Tombs were not merely endings. They were arrangements for ongoing presence. The afterlife was imagined through familiar imagery, because the Egyptians believed the dead continued in a transformed mode, still needing sustenance, protection, and orientation. This is perhaps why food offerings mattered so much. Bread, beer, oxen, birds, vegetables, fruit, incense, wine, and other goods could be depicted, named, or physically presented. To feed the dead was to honor their place in the community. It also reflected a larger idea that order should extend beyond the grave. A well-governed universe did not stop at the horizon of mortality. It continued into another realm, differently structured but still reachable through ritual and speech. And speech itself carried power. Names, titles, formulas, invocations. The sound of words could be thought of as an active force. Silence had its place too, especially in sacred precincts, but utterance mattered. It is lovely to imagine ancient voices reciting prayers in courtyards, or chanting in burial chambers, or reading administrative accounts aloud, or telling stories in shaded rooms during the hottest part of the day. The spoken word would have come and gone, but in the echo of it there might be a feeling of order settling into place. Ancient Egyptian literature, where it survives, gives us still more textures. Wisdom texts, moral reflections, tales of adventure, courtly stories, laments, and hymns. There are works that speak to patience, humility, conduct, and the uncertain behavior of the world. There are stories that move through magical or mythical landscapes. There are poems of devotion and songs of praise. Some pieces feel formal, while others are wry or intimate. This literary variety suggests a society that did not only build and administer, but reflected upon its own life in language. The story of Sinew, for example, remains one of the most haunting pieces of ancient literature, because it meditates on exile, return, identity, and the longing for home. Its emotional core feels timeless. A person leaves, wanders, prospers, and eventually feels the pull of return. The story is ancient, but the feeling is close. Home is not always a place of comfort in a simple sense, yet it is a place that calls. That call can be as soft as the river wind at dusk. There are also Egyptian tales involving the extraordinary and the strange. Lost princes, magical transformations, divine interventions, journeys into wonder or danger. Such stories remind us that ancient readers, like modern ones, enjoyed suspense, surprise, and imagination. They were not only concerned with afterlife manuals and state inscriptions, they also wanted narrative, beauty, and the satisfying turn of a plot. Human beings have always liked to sit within a story and let it carry them somewhere calm. The Nile Delta, broad and marshy, formed another kind of world from the narrow valley upstream. Its channels fanned out toward the sea. Birds gathered there, reeds rustled, fish moved through shallows. It was a landscape of water and boundary where river became geography of branching paths. Towns in the delta participated in trade, politics, and defense, and the region's openness made it strategically important. It was also in its own way serene. A wetland can feel like a place where the world slows its steps. At the far north, Egypt met the Mediterranean, a sea that connected rather than separated. Ships came and went. Coastal exchange brought new materials and ideas. Inland and maritime networks both contributed to Egypt's long life. The civilization was not just a river kingdom, though the river remained central. It was a place of junctions, between desert and water, between Africa and the Near East, between local tradition and foreign contact, between the visible world and the imagined one. One of the deepest pleasures of studying ancient Egypt is the gradual accumulation of detail. A single tomb painting is interesting, a set of objects is interesting, a text is interesting, but over time these details build a world. We begin to sense household rhythms, ceremonial structures, labor systems, artistic habits, agricultural dependence, and religious continuity. The civilization gains dimension not as a grand abstraction, but as a patterned life made from many ordinary acts repeated across centuries. And centuries matter here. Egypt was ancient for a very long time. It continued across dynastic changes, invasions, restorations, and foreign rule. It adapted to different rulers and different circumstances. In later periods, Persian, Greek, Roman, and eventually Christian and Islamic influences would each leave their mark. The ancient Egyptian world was not a sealed chapter cut cleanly from later history. It was part of a longer human continuum, with continuities and endings, survivals and transformations. Sometimes the later history is itself quietly beautiful. Temples repurposed, old gods remembered in new forms, scripts changing and eventually falling out of ordinary use, hieroglyphs becoming unreadable for many centuries, their meanings hidden until modern scholarship and the Rosetta Stone helped unlock them. That long silence in the written signs gives them a special atmosphere now. They seem to look back at us from a threshold between knowledge and mystery. It is strange and lovely to realize that writing once meant something so immediate there and later became silent. A symbol that once served temple, tomb, and administration became, for a time, a pattern without voice. Yet the silence was not total. The carvings remained, the walls remained, and then slowly their language was heard again. There is a deep comfort in that kind of recovery. It suggests that meaning can sleep and later wake. The same is true of ruins. A ruin is not only a broken building, it is a place where time has become visible. A wall loses its roof, a column stands alone, a courtyard fills with dust and light, vegetation returns in small edges, birds nest, wind moves freely where once there were doors. The ruin does not end the building's story entirely, it changes the mode of the story. Stone begins to speak differently when no one lives there in the old way. Egypt has many such places, some monumental, some modest. Some sacred, some domestic, some known by tourists and scholars, others still less familiar outside specialist circles. Every site is a reminder that the past is unevenly shared. Some kingdoms are remembered through famous names, while others are known through fragments and inscriptions. Some kings are household words, some towns are almost forgotten except by archaeologists. Yet each one was once inhabited by people who believed their lives were ordinary, even as they lived within a long history. There is also something quietly moving about how many Egyptian objects were made for practical and symbolic purposes at once. A chair could be for sitting, but also for status. A cosmetic vessel could hold oils and also signal refinement. A funerary mask could preserve the face of the dead and also embody a theology of transformation. A temple image could represent a deity and also sustain ritual presence. The object lives in several meanings at once, like a dream that remains coherent even as it shifts. The ancient Egyptians were attentive to the body, both living and dead. Hair, skin, jewelry, cosmetics, perfumes, linen garments, bodily purity all mattered. Mummification, with its careful processes, was rooted in the belief that preservation supported continuity. The body was not to be discarded carelessly. It had a place in the wider cosmos. This attention to embodied life may feel distant now, but it also reveals something deeply human, a wish not to vanish without trace. And yet no civilization fully defeats disappearance. Even Egypt, with its dry climate and enduring stones, lost countless voices. We do not know the names of most people who lived there. We do not know the full stories of most children, farmers, boatmen, potters, and labourers. We know them indirectly through traces. The absence itself is part of the atmosphere. It makes every recovered detail more precious. A scratch on a pot, a line in a ledger, a child's grave, a toy, a ration list. These are small lanterns in a very long corridor. Perhaps this is why ancient Egypt can be such a restful subject for the mind. It combines grandeur with detail, certainty with mystery, permanence with loss. It invites us to imagine a world where the river kept time, where stars guided calendars, where names mattered, where offerings maintained connection, and where the dead were not entirely gone. Such a world is not simple, but it is coherent enough to hold the wandering thoughts gently. And it is also full of quiet weather, warm wind over stone, shade beneath a portico, dust lifting in a sunbeam, reeds moving at the edge of water, a heron standing still, the low murmur of voices indoors, the sound of a chisel, the brush of linen, the faint smell of incense, the measured splash of oars. These are the sensory threads from which ancient Egypt can be woven in the imagination, slowly and softly, without urgency. The gods, too, seem to move through this atmosphere rather than dominate it. The sun's daily passage, the moon's measured glow, the stars above the desert, the river beneath. The idea that order was not absolute but continually renewed. This renewal may be one of the loveliest aspects of Egyptian thought. Nothing simply remained fixed forever. Even the sun had a nightly journey. Even the dead required rites to continue. Even the king's name needed preservation. Continuity was a labor and therefore a gift. One can think, too, of the workers whose labor made monuments possible. The quarry teams, the stone haulers, the masons, the painters, the carpenters, the rope makers, the farmers who fed them, the administrators who organized supplies. Behind every grand structure is a network of ordinary effort. The grandeur does not erase the human scale, it depends on it. A huge temple is also thousands of lifted hands. A tomb is also measured labor over years. A statue is also the patient shaping of material by people who may never have had their own names carved in stone. That is worth remembering before sleep. Much of what endures in the world is the result of quiet repetition. A field watered, a wall repaired, a tablet inscribed, a roof patched, a vessel carried, a child taught, a ritual repeated. History often favors the loud moment, but civilization depends on the quiet one. And so the Nile keeps moving in the imagination, even when the room around you becomes still. The river is not in a hurry. It knows how to pass through darkness and light, through flood and drought, through seasons of plenty and years of strain. It has seen kingdoms rise and fall. It has borne barges, reeds, fish, people, taxes, prayers, and the reflection of stars. It has touched the feet of children and the hulls of boats and the roots of plants. It has been observed by generations who looked out from the bank and trusted the return of water. That trust itself is an ancient feeling. Not certainty, but trust. The expectation that dawn will come, that the flood will be measured, that names can be spoken again, that bread will be baked, that the world's patterns, however fragile, may hold. Ancient Egypt was built on such trust and on the institutions that supported it and on the stories that made it meaningful. If there is a final comfort in this long, slow history, it may be that human beings have always made places where continuity can be felt. A river valley, a burial chamber, a written page, a family offering, a temple corridor, a remembered name, a small object held in the hand. Ancient Egypt preserved many of these things, and in preserving them it left behind a language of patience. So let the river fade more softly now. Let the temples stand in silence. Let the papyrus pages lie flat and still. Let the stars above the desert remain where they are. The past does not need us to hurry toward it. It is already there, quietly waiting, as the warm night settles and the mind grows lighter. And somewhere beyond the desert edge and the sleeping fields, the Nile continues its gentle course, carrying the memory of water into the deep calm of the dark. Beyond the riverbank, there are also the marshes, those quieter margins where water does not rush but lingers. In the delta, the land opens into branching channels, low green growth, birds lifting from the reeds, and shallow pools reflecting the sky in broken pieces. It is easy to imagine how ancient people would have watched this landscape carefully, noticing which channels widened, which narrowed, where fish gathered, where papyrus grew thickly enough for cutting. The marsh was not merely empty space between important things. It was a living borderland, a place of abundance and concealment, of hunting and harvest, of uncertainty and shelter. Papyrus itself belonged to the river in a way that feels almost symbolic. From its stems came writing sheets, baskets, mats, sandals, rope, and boats. A single plant could become many useful things. That too has the quiet elegance of ancient Egypt, the transformation of what the river offered into what a civilization needed. The reed became a page. The page carried a prayer. The prayer outlasted the hand that wrote it. In this way, a plant growing in water became one of the vessels of memory, and memory was everywhere. It lived in tomb paintings where someone placed food before a table. It lived in spells copied and recopied by scribes who believed that words could guide and protect. It lived in family names passed down, in titles inherited, in customary gestures repeated at shrines. The Egyptians did not seem to think of time as something that simply erased what had gone before. Instead, they built with the expectation that the past could remain nearby, if properly cared for. This gave their world a special kind of depth. A house, a statue, a coffin, a temple wall, these were not only objects of the present, they were also addresses for the past. There is something tender in that thought. To keep a name spoken, to keep a face painted, to keep a story in circulation. The dead in Egypt were not imagined as entirely absent. They were addressed, fed, remembered, and ritually supported. The living and the dead shared the landscape in a layered way. A tomb was not just a place of ending. It was a threshold, a chamber of continued relation. Even the equipment placed within a burial, small figurines, vessels, amulets, food offerings, linen wrappings, suggests a desire not for spectacle, but for care. Care extended beyond sight. And as the centuries passed, the physical remains of that care became astonishing to later generations. Travelers crossing Egypt in Roman times, medieval times, and the era of early exploration encountered temples half buried in sand, statues weathered by wind, inscriptions half legible, and tombs sealed so thoroughly they seemed to belong to a world already withdrawn. Some imagined giants, some imagined lost wisdom, some simply marveled. The land itself seems to have preserved its history in a patient hush, letting stone endure longer than spoken language, and letting the desert protect what it could not revive. There are so many silent places in Egypt, the long avenues leading to temple doorways, the inner sanctuaries where only a few could enter, the cliffs along the west bank where tombs were cut into rock, the hidden chambers beneath pyramids, the deserted quarry faces, the abandoned administrative towns whose mud brick walls have softened back toward earth. Even in their emptiness, these places feel inhabited by intent. Someone measured them, someone aligned them, someone carried tools there in the cool morning, someone waited for the work to be finished. It is easy to picture the earliest light on limestone, soft gold across stone. A boat moving in shadow, then entering brightness. The Nile did not only feed agriculture, it also organized attention. Cities, cemeteries, gardens, temples, fields, and roads all turned in relation to it. The river made orientation possible. In a landscape where the horizon could feel immense and still, the water gave direction. North and south were traced by its flow. Seasonal life followed its pulse. Even the smallest village could feel connected to the widest system of exchange, because the river carried goods, people, and news. The boats themselves belonged to a world of careful craft. A river vessel had to be assembled with knowledge of reeds, planks, lashings, sailcloth, and current. Cargo boats transporting grain, stone, beer jars, onions, cattle, tools, and temple offerings. Smaller boats moved from one bank to the other. Fishing boats worked in shallow waters. Royal barges, in their turn, could be richly appointed, with painted cabins and shaded spaces. Yet even the grandest vessel would have depended on the same basic elements: water, wind, and skill. The river did not distinguish between humble and splendid. It carried all that could float. The same is true of the moon over Egypt, which may have seemed especially clear in the dry air and open sky. Night in the ancient world could be profoundly dark, and so each source of light mattered. Torches flickered. Lamps glowed, firelight shifted across walls. The stars were not an ornament but a structure of navigation and thought. The Egyptians, like many ancient peoples, looked upward and made patterns from the heavens. They gave names and meanings to celestial motions. The sky was not empty. It was ordered, observed, and tied to time. This observance found its place in temples where priests carried out rituals at appointed hours. A temple was not only a building. It was also a schedule, a rhythm, a maintained relationship between human life and divine presence. The deity's image might be washed, clothed, anointed, and fed in a sequence of actions that repeated day after day. The continuity of this work helped define the sacredness of the site. In such spaces, even silence can feel ceremonial. The coolness of stone, the scent of natron and oil, the faint scrape of sandals on floor slabs, the long shaft of daylight moving slowly across a court. Beyond the official religion, there was the more intimate and local life of belief. People wore amulets. They invoked protective deities. They asked for healing, safe childbirth, successful work, and good dreams. They loved their children, buried their dead, and hoped for relief from illness or misfortune. The monumental and the ordinary were not separate worlds. They existed together. A great temple in stone and a small household charm may both reflect the same wish for order against uncertainty. Even in the everyday domestic sphere, Egypt offers many small quiet facts that are strangely calming to imagine. The grinding of grain on a low stone surface, the shaping of dough, the storing of barley and emmer in bins, the weaving of linen, the making of cosmetics from minerals, the careful eyelining that appears in portraits and remains in archaeological finds, the use of coal, practical and aesthetic at once, the arrangement of stools, baskets, jars and jars nested inside larger jars. The domestic soundscape must have been gentle in its own way, full of ordinary tasks repeated with enough regularity to make life feel knowable. Some houses were modest, some more spacious, but all lived within the same larger pattern of settlement. Adobe walls rose from mud mixed with straw. Roofs may have supported sleeping spaces in warm weather. Courtyards collected light. Doorways opened to small lanes. In towns, children likely played near neighbors' homes, while animals moved through the edges of work and domestic life. There is a humanity in these settings that can be easy to overlook when the mind is drawn to pyramids and kings. Yet civilizations are built as much in kitchens and storerooms as in palaces. The royal court, of course, had its own gravity. Pharaohs appear to modern minds as distant, almost mythical figures, and in some ways the image is appropriate. They represented continuity between land, gods, and people. Their names were preserved in cartouches. Their monuments asserted permanence, yet even kings were mortal. Their tombs, no matter how immense, were also gestures against disappearance. A pharaoh's burial chamber was a place where power and vulnerability met. The grander the monument, the more it suggests an awareness that time is patient. And time in Egypt is one of the most moving subjects of all. The Great Pyramid has stood for millennia, but it was once part of a complete funerary landscape with causeways, temples, subsidiary tombs, and workers' settlements. The temples of Karnak and Luxor grew across centuries, each generation adding, modifying, re-inscribing. The site of Abydos held layers of devotion and royal association over enormous stretches of time. The Valley of the Kings concealed tombs in a dry fold of stone, and even there, hidden from casual view, the work of memory continued. Egypt seems to teach that no structure is only one moment. It is often many moments laid together. There are also the small mysteries that keep this civilization so gently alive in the imagination. A painted board game left in a tomb, a missing mummy, a damaged inscription, a statue deliberately broken and later repaired, a room whose use remains uncertain, a princess whose life is known only through fragments, a settlement discovered in the earth then slowly mapped and remapped by archaeologists. These gaps are not failures of history, they are part of its atmosphere. The incomplete record leaves room for wonder, and wonder, when kept calm, can be restful. Ancient Egypt's relationship with the afterlife is especially rich in this regard. It was not simply about death as an ending, but about continued existence in another mode. The journey through the underworld, the weighing of the heart, the identification with Osiris, the protective spells, the funerary texts, the painted tomb scenes of food, music, farming, and dancing, all of this suggests an afterlife imagined not as abstraction, but as transformed daily life. The deceased might still eat, travel, speak, and encounter divine beings. In some sense, the next world remained social. This may be one reason the tomb paintings are so affecting. They are not usually grim. They often show birds, gardens, boats, fish, servants, fields, and gatherings. The walls can seem busy with a world made whole. Even the journey beyond life is pictured with continuity in mind. The soul travels, the body rests, the name persists, the family remembers, the offering is brought, the stone closes, the ritual continues in speech, and speech was precious. The written word in Egypt carried special force because it could preserve names, formulate prayers, organize administration, and make visible the invisible patterns of the world. Hieroglyphs are often admired for their beauty, and rightly so. They can look like a conversation between image and sound, between picture and meaning. A bird, an eye, a loaf, a reed, a hand, a star. To see them is already to sense the care with which they were made. For many centuries, their full reading was lost to the outside world, and their return to understanding felt almost like hearing a long muffled voice speak again. That rediscovery itself has a kind of bedtime quietness to it, if one thinks of scholars bending over fragments, translating names, comparing signs, slowly opening a door that had been closed. Not everything in history arrives with spectacle. Sometimes knowledge returns by patience, by attention, by the repeated looking at stone. The past does not always yield itself quickly. It waits for a slower kind of mind, and slow minds in their own way are drawn to the edges of the great civilization as much as to its center. To Nubia, where exchange, conflict, and mutual influence shaped kingdoms along the southern reaches of the river. To the Sinai, where expeditions sought turquoise and copper in harsh landscapes. To the eastern desert, where routes crossed dry valleys toward the Red Sea. To the oases, where isolated water made life possible in unlikely places. Ancient Egypt was not sealed off. It was connected by roads, waterways, and caravan routes to neighboring worlds. Gold, incense, timber, stone, and ideas moved through these channels, often more quietly than the famous monuments suggest. In the Red Sea region, one can imagine the rougher soundscape of harbor activity, ropes creaking, sails snapping lightly, men calling across timbered docks, jars being loaded, crews preparing for departure. Expeditions to distant lands were undertaken for prized materials and exotic goods. The ancient Egyptians were not only river people, they were also desert navigators, sailors, miners, traders, and administrators of long supply lines. The state had a reach that extended into places where the land itself could seem almost uninhabitable. Yet even there, human organization made temporary worlds. The deserts in turn gave Egypt something very rare, boundaries that could preserve. Sand can erase, but it can also shelter. Rock-cut tombs, buried towns, and dry deposits have survived because moisture was low and disturbance was limited. In this way, the desert became an archive. It held fragments of woven cloth, wooden furniture, bread loaves, leather sandals, toys, cosmetics, letters, and tools. Such remains are especially moving because they are intimate. They are not only the inheritance of rulers, they are the traces of lived days. A small toy from antiquity can feel as poignant as a royal statue. A doll, a little animal figure, a game board with worn pieces. A child's place in history may be brief, but the objects left behind can still suggest play, curiosity, and care. Ancient Egypt had children, as every society does, though the surviving record naturally favors what was durable. Still, one can imagine young voices in courtyards, the practice of learning to write, the help given in household work, the small rituals of growing up beside the river's cycle. The same flood that nourished fields also shaped childhood time. Seasons were not abstract on a wall calendar. They were experienced in the body, in work, in food, and in the smells of wet earth. Agricultural life along the Nile depended on observation and cooperation. Farmers watched the levels of the river, prepared basins, managed canals, and timed planting carefully after the floodwaters receded. This was not a passive relationship with nature. It was a negotiated one, The river offered silt and moisture, but it also required planning. Schedules mattered, tools mattered, boundaries mattered. Fields had to be measured, reclaimed, and worked in sequence. In such a system, precision becomes a form of peace. One does not rush the land, one learns its rhythms. The calendar itself was shaped by this rhythm. The seasons of inundation, growth, and harvest ordered the year in a way that was both practical and symbolic. People lived within a cycle of return: flood, planting, harvest, waxing moon, waning moon, day, night, life, death, remembrance. The repetition of forms may have helped create the sense that existence, though never truly fixed, was intelligible. A human being could orient a life to recurring patterns. That in the midst of uncertainty is deeply comforting. There are moments in Egyptian art where this comfort feels especially visible. A banquet scene with musicians and guests, a garden with a pool and trees, a nobleman and his family standing in orderly symmetry, a field of papyrus, a painted offering table filled with bread, fowl, fruit, and jars. The images are formal, but they also breathe. They reveal a civilization that valued preservation not just of authority, but of form, gesture, and relation. Even a scene of work can be graceful. Even a list of offerings can carry a feeling of abundance. Some of the most famous monuments in the world belong to Egypt, yet it is often the less famous details that linger softly in the mind. The slope of a corridor, the coloring on a fragment of plaster, the curve of a lotus capital, the way a statue's gaze seems to wait beyond the viewer, the careful placement of stones at a mortuary temple, the hidden courtyards behind walls, the cool inner darkness after bright desert sun. These details invite stillness. They ask not for excitement but for attention. There is also a profound beauty in the fact that much of Egypt's ancient heritage was made from materials chosen for different durations. Mud brick for homes and towns, which allowed fast construction but endured only in fragments. Stone for temples, tombs, and royal works, intended for far longer continuity. Wood for furniture and boats, which could be precious because it was scarce. Linen for clothing and burial wrappings, light and clean and useful, then mostly lost unless conditions favored survival. The civilization itself seems to have understood different levels of permanence. Not everything needed to last forever. Some things were meant for use, some for ritual, some for memory. And memory often gathered around images of rebirth: the rising sun, the blooming lotus, the renewing flood. The appearance of life from hidden places. Even the journey of the sun god across the night sky, though solemn, ends in return. Such mythic patterns did not cancel grief or mortality. They framed them. They gave people language for hope without denying loss. This, perhaps, is one of the gentlest gifts of ancient mythology. It holds darkness in a shape that can be contemplated. Egyptian mythology itself is full of figures who seem to drift between cosmic scale and intimate human feeling. Isis searching for Osiris, Horus avenging and inheriting, Thoth measuring and recording, Anubis guarding the dead, Hathor welcoming the living and the departed, Bastet associated with home and protection, Sekhmet with heat and power, Sobek linked to the river's watery force. Each god or goddess belonged not to abstraction alone, but to a felt aspect of life. The divine world was not remote. It was thought to be present in nature, kingship, healing magic, and the ordinary needs of people. And magic in ancient Egypt was not necessarily seen as something separate from religion or medicine. Protection formulas, amulets, healing texts, and ritual actions were part of a shared effort to restore balance. There is something calming in that integration. A world in which illness, injury, or fear were addressed through both practical and symbolic means. A charm against harm, a prescription for pain, a prayer for safe passage, a spoken phrase to steady what is fragile. The ancient record preserves many such attempts to make life more livable. In the end, perhaps what remains most vivid is the interplay of movement and stillness. The river moves, boats move, seasons move, names are carried forward, yet stone stands, tombs rest, figures sit, statues gaze. The contrast creates a quiet tension at the heart of Egyptian civilization. It is a culture of passage that loved to build for endurance. It trusted motion but also cherished form. It accepted that water would pass through the land while learning how to shape banks, fields, and buildings in response. So the mind may drift slowly among these layered scenes: a temple at dawn, a field after flood, a boat under sail, a scribe bent over a tablet, a priest carrying incense, a mason fitting a stone block, a family making offerings to the dead, a child holding a small toy, a cat curling in a shaded corner, a star appearing above the desert, a reed pen touching papyrus, a doorway opening and then closing gently behind someone entering the cool interior. And if one listens long enough in imagination, the sounds remain soft: water against wood, footsteps on stone, linen in the breeze, the turning of pages, a distant call across the river, the rustle of reeds, the breath of night over the desert. These are not the sounds of urgency, they are the sounds of continuity. For a civilization so old, ancient Egypt still feels near in some ways, perhaps because it preserved so many human concerns in recognizable forms: work, family, belief, food, burial, order, beauty, and the hope that something of oneself might endure. Its monuments are vast, but its deepest lesson may be small and steady: that life is made of repetitions carefully tended. The flood returns, the fields green again, the dead are remembered again, the sun rises again. The names are spoken again. The stories are told again, softly enough to fit inside the dark. And now, as the river narrows in the imagination and the stars seem farther away, let everything grow quieter still. Let the papyrus stalks sway without sound. Let the boats rest tied at the bank. Let the temples keep their silence. Let the great stones keep their patient memory. The Nile continues, unseen for a moment, and then seen only as a suggestion of movement in the dark. The night remains gentle over Egypt. The desert keeps its stillness, the river keeps its course, and the long, ancient world, with all its labor and ritual and mystery, can settle now into a final calm, like water lying smooth beneath the moon, waiting for morning without needing to speak.